The Art of the
Usual.
Victorian Crazy Quilt. I'm Sue Bonafini, Assistant Director of the Cobblestone Museum, as Doug said, which lies in the hamlet of Childs in Orleans County, New York, between Rochester and Buffalo. We welcome visitors at the museum May through October to tour our 10 campus buildings with the help of our guides. And our buildings include 3 cobblestone National Historic Landmark structures. As viewers continue to join us here at the top of the hour, I'm going to continue with some introductory remarks. And please remember, as Doug indicated, your microphones should remain muted because we want to prevent some unwanted background noise. Many of you are joining our virtual audience for the first time, and we're so happy that you've discovered us. Some of you are return viewers to our virtual programming, so welcome back. Our virtual lectures began in 2021. Our first was also a quilt-themed presentation, and today's Crazy Quilts talk marks our 3rd quilt-related program. Today, you've helped us to make history because we've accepted 60 registrations, 60, for this presentation, a record high to date. And there are viewers from at least 14 different states across multiple time zones as well. So if you know how to use the Zoom chat box, go ahead and feel free to share your location with the others in the audience. As Doug mentioned, our volunteer Brenda, who is an avid quilter, is going to be with us today. And she actually suggested today's topic of crazy quilts. Brenda's going to monitor the chat box. And Betsy will answer all of your questions, but only at the end of her talk. And you'll be directed to type additional questions into the box as well. As Doug mentioned, if anyone has any difficulty using the chat box, at the end, we'll allow people who have questions, if time permits, to just raise their hand and to speak. This program is made possible today with the sponsorship from a Cobblestone Society member from Alcott, New York, with additional funding from Country Treasures Quilt Shop in Brockport, New York. And of course, the generous support of each of you who registered for this event. A sincere thank you. And we're especially grateful for those of you who chose to support us at higher levels of giving. Betsy has given us permission to record today's presentation, and recording is underway. So if you prefer to shut off your camera, you can do so with the camera icon in the lower left corner of your screen, just below your screen. Our speaker is making history with us today too, because this is her first virtual lecture, and we are all part of her first virtual audience. Betsy has lectured about antique quilts throughout her career, sharing her expertise and selling her incredible quilts in the United States and abroad. She has connections with clients in the UK, France, Australia, and one of her favorite places is Japan, where interpreters are needed for her lectures. Imagine that. Betsy says that she's uncomfortable speaking about herself, so I'm going to share her story, which I find very interesting, and I hope you will too. So I'm going to now introduce our speaker with her story. Betsy Telford Goodwin is the owner of Rocky Mountain Quilts in York, Maine. She's been in business for over 3 decades since launching that business in Colorado, where its name originated. 4 mint condition antique quilts began her business. Today, approximately 700 quilts are within her shop, a converted 18th century barn, complete with a bathtub for hand washing quilts. She describes antique quilts as art pieces, visually comforting, graphic, and very undervalued in her opinion. It's possible her passion for quilts was inherited. Her great-grandfather ran numerous textile mills in New England. She's a qualified antique quilt appraiser, a member of the Antiques Council of America, the American Society of Interior Designers, and 3 New England-based antiques societies. She has participated in or been featured at dozens of highly regarded quilt shows, featured in over 30 magazines here and abroad, and interviewed by the Discovery Channel and New England television programs. A native Bostonian, she began sewing on her beloved treadle sewing machine as a young girl. Through her education at the Beaver Country Day School, her junior year requirement was to sew, and not a trivial assignment, a suit, a complete suit. And that took her to a higher skill level of sewing. College plans led her to the goal of becoming a teacher, but her passion for quilts just guided her into a different direction. Betsy's clients needed quilts repaired, so hand washing and restoring them was inevitable. From the start, she used same date or older fabrics in restorations. She spent time out west with Depression-era women. She listened for hours to their tales of quilt making, which was both a social and necessary activity. She developed a method of restoration, and she taught talented hand sewers the art with a 1-inch needle that she says is very difficult to thread. Yard sales and antique shops provided genuine antique fabrics. Traveling back east made it possible to find even older fabrics dating back as far as the 18th century. She'd buy whole cloth quilts. She'd take them apart for their fabric. And while doing so, this enabled her to learn the techniques that were used in their construction. She's largely self-taught, but she enjoys brainstorming with others in the field to expand her knowledge. Today, 3 skilled employees make custom quilts and provide restoration services. Her website is maintained by her husband, who's provided her slideshow for use today. Betsy thinks she may have the largest collection of antique fabrics outside of a museum in the United States. A proud mother and grandmother of 5, who lectures to hundreds in person with ease, is about to accept the challenge of her first Zoom presentation. So let's show some on-screen support with our applause to welcome Betsy Telford Goodwin. It's all yours, Betsy.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me from all over the country, and especially from my family. Thank you for coming. Before we start the discussion of the Victorian crazy quilt, I think we need some background from where it originated. And if we can go back as far as the 1700s and the early 1800s, when merchants from Salem, Mass. And Boston, Mass. Made their living and extraordinary fortunes by taking opium from India to China and coming back from China with porcelain and other goods, tea, silk, and porcelain. But Japan was a closed country. Are you seeing that? Okay. I'm not sure how to work this. So sometimes X's come up, so I have to put it away. Japan was a closed country. The only people, for some reason, that were allowed in Japan were the Dutch. Americans and English were never allowed there. They were terrified of Christianity. They were afraid that Christianity would pollute their Buddhist religion and their country. Are you people seeing that X? No? Okay. All right. But by the mid 1700s, President Fillmore decided that he wanted to get into trade with Japan. In 1853, Commodore Perry took a Navy fleet to Tokyo Bay and threatened the Japanese with annihilation of Tokyo if they did not allow the Americans into their country.
Hey, Betsy, just a second. This is Doug. Thank you for the nice beginning. Were you trying to share your screen?
Not yet.
Okay.
How
Richard,
do we do that?
I'll leave you in charge of that then when she's ready.
No, you're not sharing yet.
Okay, continue, Betsy.
Everything is not visual at the moment.
The
slideshow hasn't started yet. Is that what you mean, Doug?
Very good. Yes, you're okay. Thank you.
Everyone can tell that this is my first at this. The shogun was eventually overturned in Japan, and an emperor was reinstated in around 1868. And this young emperor at the age of 16 decided that he wanted to modernize Japan. At that point, they started putting in railroads, raising an army and a navy. And he felt at this point that he wanted the rest of the world to know about Japan. So in 1876, when we had the first National Exposition, which was the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia, they wanted to have a huge exhibit there. So they did. Ironically, Americans fell in love with the old Japan, not the new Japan. They loved their clean lines. They loved their arts. And at this point in America, during the Victorian age, everything was embellished. When Americans today had finished decorating their homes, people in the Victorian era had just started. And what I say is they embellished the embellished. They just kept on going. But Americans fell in love with the straight lines, the clean lines, and the art of Japan. Someone, the name is lost forever, started developing Victorian crazy quilts, which were a love that came from the Japanese screens that were at the exhibit in Philadelphia. At this point, during the 1880s, silks was extraordinarily expensive. So Victorian crazy quilts were only for the very affluent to do. So, and the first people to really start them were Bostonians. They used silks, they used silk velvets, and I can show you, can you make the screen, is the screen bigger to people, or are they seeing a little piece?
Looks like this.
Okay, can we make the screen bigger now, so I can show things?
The screen doesn't get bigger.
Oh, all right,
Just
okay,
hold them up.
all right, so they used everything. We have ribbons. We have silk, small ribbons that they would make flower adaptations. We have actual gold ribbons. We have silk twists, which they could have used instead of a binding around the outside of a quilt. And one of those I will actually show you later. When working with silk, you always use everything that is silk. So you would use silk threads. And here is more silk that they would have twisted and made gorgeous designs on the crazy quilts. They used twists, silk twist threads. Every crazy quilt is different. I have never seen two that are exactly the same. And the reason for this is it's all individual art. There's no pattern. There's a goal. There's a goal of the look of the Victorian crazy quilt, but the way people assemble them and what they use in making them is never the same. They use ribbons and lace. They used emblems from the inside of men's hats. They used all kinds of whatever that made them think of wonderful memories. Sometimes people have said that there's a date on a quilt from, 1853. And I said, no, there were no crazy quilts before. The earliest one that I know of is 1878. So this must have been the date for a marriage. It could have been a birth. It could have been anything. They would have put symbols on crazy quilts of anything that made them happy. There were crazy quilts also for very sad purposes. There was something called mourning quilts. And usually mourning quilts were buried with the person who passed away, but some of them have survived. And in 37 years, I've had the privilege of having 4 such crazy quilts. They're always in black with gold thread. For some reason, it was always gold on black. One of these today is in England, one of them is in Japan, and 2 of them are still in the United States. These were saved as part of the family history, and they were absolutely gorgeous, but they're very, very rare. I don't even know of a museum that has one. Okay, the styles of making, can we do a PowerPoint, please? Yep. Hold on, everyone. Okay, this Victorian crazy quilt is one of the most exquisite ones that I have ever had. You'll see this one is done in block formation. There are 20 blocks, 1, 2, 3, provide 20 blocks. And then we have the prairie points around the edge. And this piece is absolutely exquisite. It's completely original. There's been no restoration done on this. Jean and Jackie do restoration on these quilts. Jean does most of the crazy quilt restoration, but Jackie has actually made some of these from scratch for clients, for a very specific client out west. But this one is completely done by hand. You can see fans in each of the 4 corners that represent Japanese fans. You're going to see a lot of the symbols of Japan. And during this era, we loved everything to do with animals and flowers and birds. And so you will see everything embellished on these quilts. If you look for the second to the bottom row, you'll see a ribbon. And you can't see the picture, but there's images of a little girl on there. You can see flowers on this quilt. This quilt was stuffed and backed. They were never meant to be used. They were only made as embellishment. They won't stand up and you really can't wash them. Each of these individual fabrics can be washed because there was no such thing as a dry cleaners in the 1880s, and the quilt should never go to the dry cleaners. But each piece of fabric can be individually washed. However, the dark colors can run. So you can never wash these quilts because the colors can run all over the place. How did I learn? Yes, the hard way. Fortunately, on one of mine, which is how I always practiced. But this is going to be absolutely one of the most beautiful ones you'll see. How do you do? Okay, up, or down?
Oh.
Wait a minute. Okay.
Up.
Oh, that's my shop.
Now it'll work.
Okay. This one only measures 37 by 70 inches. It's from Maine. It's a wonderful size to hang in your home. And all these pieces of magnificent art on your wall. This one is also done in block formation, but you can see the different adaptation is that they have put a sashing between each block and then embellished the sashing. The mark of excellence for a Victorian crazy quilt is 100 different stitches. Most of these quilts that I am showing you far surpasses that. And you can see on this quilt, you can see in this the middle, second row from the top, the middle block, you can see that they actually did a quilt pattern. There's a tumbling block pattern in the middle of this. And to the left of that is a crazy quilt pattern. So some of these crazy quilt patterns would adapt regular quilting patterns onto their adaptation of their crazy quilt. And again, you can see how none of them look the same. This is the only crazy quilt, child's quilt that I've ever had. And it's sort of an adaptation, not exactly crazy quilt, but it's embellished like a crazy quilt. It's a center medallion, which is a format that came to us from England, where quilts were originally started. The letter T in the middle is either representing the little girl's name or first name or last name. And you can see the border. This quilt is 1890s. And as I said, in the 1880s, fabrics, the silk fabrics are extraordinarily expensive. So only the affluent were making these quilts. Well, by the 1890s, the fabric manufacturers jumped on this bandwagon and decided to make silks that everyone could afford. But in order to make those silks affordable, there had to be fewer threads per inch. 1880s and earlier silks were very crisp and thick. In order to do that, they added lead to the silk to make them feel thicker. Well, of course, the lead disintegrated the silks. And as you can see from this little piece, it is not in perfect condition. And if you look on the left, you'll see white spots in the peach colors, and that's where the fabric, it just disintegrates. It almost becomes wispy. And it's not from use, it's just from air, and that's because of the lead in the silk. This is an original miniature Victorian crazy quilt that I also found in Maine. It's only 21 by 21 inches, which is a perfect size for hanging. And you can see the edging around the side and the four little tabs. That's made out of the twist that I just showed you, that I showed you originally. Instead of a binding, they use that. The back of this quilt is a burgundy silk velvet. And you're going to find a lot of silk velvet on the early crazy quilts. It was another very rich, expensive fabric. And look at the embellishment on this quilt. You can see instead of one row of embellishment around pieces, you can see 2 and 3 and 4 rows. It's just a beautifully, beautifully done piece, and it's very easy to hang because of the size. It can almost go any place, but it's again in perfect condition. Okay, now we're getting to another venue of crazy quilts. This is a wool crazy quilt, also from the 1880s. I think it's when you say circa, it gives us 10 years increments. So it can be a little older than that, and I think it is a little older. It's 74 by 74 inches. Wool challis is made from wool and silk thread, so it's not as substantial as plain wool. However, this quilt was meant to be used. It has a woolen batting and a backing. It's simple. It has basically the same stitches you can see all the way around each piece. It's beautifully made. It's vibrant colors, and ironically, today these colors are more in style than they were 10 years ago. Today, orange and chrome yellow are very in style. 10 years ago, this quilt would not have been loved by the masses in America. Today, these are colors that are sought after. This is also done in the block formation, and that was handy because people could take the blocks with them and work on them. I'm not, piecing these together to look as major pieces of art, even though they're called crazy quilts, they had to be very well organized. Otherwise, you'd end up with a very ugly quilt, which I would not purchase. This quilt has been, my husband and I found this on a trip to Vermont. It's a New York crazy quilt. It's made from silk velvets. Now, silk velvet can wear the silk, the silk can come off from the cotton backing. We have not changed that. Jackie has restored some of this. It was not in perfect condition. It is now. It's very, very rich. And obviously the woman that made this was extraordinary affluent, because this fabric would have been unbelievably expensive. And the time that went into making this, only affluent women had this time. We didn't have washing machines and dryers and, toaster ovens and everything else. Women that weren't affluent and didn't have servants, spent most of their time taking care of their family, and most of the quilts that they made were made to keep warm and use, where these were not. These were literally showpieces that went along with the Victorian era, but copied from the ideas of Japan and their simple lines. This one isn't too simple, but it's the same. There's a sentimental format, and it's made in the same way. And you see his other symbols on the bottom. You'll see wheat, which is the staff of life. They're filled with symbols. They are so symbolic. Here's another gorgeous one that's made in a different formation. It's made in a strip formation, and there are 7 strips that were 7 strips that were made individually and then put together. It has a prairie point border. Behind the border is lace. Now, lace is usually indicative of an Irish family. Whether this came from an Irish family, I do not know. It's a Massachusetts piece. It's in perfect condition. It's also absolutely exquisite. But after even just looking at these few, you can see how different each one is. This also is a silk velvet one. This one has been in Australia and is now, it was purchased for me from a gentleman in Australia. It's now back for me to resell for him, because they are going into a smaller home. Most of this is silk velvet. It's obvious the staff of life must have been very, very important to these people, because you see it all straight down the diagonal piece. Also on here, and I don't know if it's on this one, but you find flags, you find American flags and other symbols. I have a collection of cigarette premiums and cigar premiums, and these are something that they would put on here. I don't know of anyone else that has these collections, but this is another something else. Cigarettes and cigars came with premiums in them, and it was a trick. So the wife would go back and buy the same brand of whatever and get more of that product for the woman who was making the quilts. So you find different kinds of ribbons from different countries. Universities were a big thing to put on a crazy quilt, where somebody graduated. But the American flag does show up a lot on these. Okay, as far as I'm concerned, this looks like modern art. It could go in a glass and chrome home. It is made out of silk with the brick border. It is mid-1800s, mid-1880s. It has, to see the border, it has a strip piece border. It's in perfect condition, and it just is so different than any other crazy quilt that I have ever had. But to me, it just looks like modern art, even though it's 140 years old. But because these were not used, more of them have lasted. Many of these crazy quilts were never backed and stuffed. And the reason for that is because they were not supposed to be used. But today people want to hang them. So they'll bring them to us and to back and to stuff and to reverse tie and get them all ready to hang, so that they can use them as art in their home, which they are. Cotton ones. Now we're getting into sociology. Less affluent families. This is 20th century. It's still a crazy quilt, but it's not embellished. It's just totally different. It's made in strip formation and block formation. It's made out of clothing, women's clothing from the late 1920s. It's supposed to be used, and this was meant to be used. But for some reason, the family felt it was too precious and did not use it. But see how different it is? It doesn't feel rich. It feels graphic and wonderful and creative, but it emulates a totally different feeling than any other quilts, than the original Silk Crazy quilts. Now we're into folk art. This is a folk art crazy quilt that I absolutely love. It has cats and animals all over it. It has the farm scene, chickens. Jean, who restores a lot of these crazy quilts, also has her chickens. So here's your chicken, Jean. It's dated 1900. This quilt was definitely to be used, but it's major folk art, and it just screams hang me on the wall. However, it's a great cuddle quilt. It's warm and cozy and can be used. And Think of Me is stitched right on the quilt, so it was made with love for someone. It's made out of, you can see a strip on one side. It must not have been big enough. They had made it in a 9-block formation, but then decided the quilt wasn't big enough and added a crazy quilt square, a crazy quilt strip. And this is original to that piece, even though it was not original to her design. And you can see the different folky embellishment. There's nothing sophisticated about this. It's just major folk art. I really feel today these quilts are so underpriced, and not to sound sexist, but I feel that it's women's work and women's work is underpriced. If this was an oil, this piece would be selling for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it's just, I feel not appreciated like the others. This is an optical illusion crazy quilt. It's a 9-block formation. However, it has a Lemoyne pieced star in the middle of each block. It's optical illusion because your eye goes from the star to the crazy quilt. The crazy quilt part is embellished, not heavily embellished, but just enough. Personally, I feel that this was not meant to be heavily embellished because of what it is. It would spoil the optical illusion effect. It's in perfect condition. It's never been used. Many of these, as I say, were packed away and never used. This is one of my favorites. There are over 100 original oil paintings on this quilt. It's in perfect condition. This woman obviously was a major artist. They're all miniature blocked. It's pristine. I happen to just love this. And of course, we at that time were in love with, flora and fauna. It's so Victorian. But can you imagine the months and months of work that went into all of these? And something like this, I would feel it would even be longer. But again, they did it in block formation, so they could take it with them. They could do one at a time, and then it went together. This has been what came back. It's ready to hang. I wouldn't use this. I would use it as a piece of art on the wall. 70 by 82 inches is also a great size, and we know it came from Cambridge, Ohio. This is signed and dated Crazy Quilt and it's filled with Native American symbols. I cannot guarantee that a Native American made this, but it certainly feels that way. I found it in Maine, in northern Maine. And of course, there are many Native Americans in Maine. It's wool. It's meant to be used. It's very simple. It's not complicated, but it's their adaptation of a Victorian crazy quilt. It's wool, so it would be warm. And you can see on there like rows of plantings and seeds and different symbols that are just nature bound. This I love. This is heavy. This is you want to cuddle under a wonderful quilt in the winter? Here it is. This is a silk velvet crazy quilt. And it's stuffed with wool and backed. So it is warm. It's different than any of the others that you've seen here, and you can see it's done in the 4-block formation with a border all the way around. It's not heavily embellished. It's just outline embellished, but not extra embellished. It's never been used. Many of these quilts people felt they were just too precious to use, and they just packed them away for 100 years. So here they are now for more people to enjoy. Okay, now we're going to look at some of the things that actually go into these crazy quilts. This is a ribbon, and on the ribbon is a hand-painted oil that they would put into a crazy quilt. I have tons of these things that never made their way into Victorian crazy quilts, and people buy them for me to make their own crazy quilts to put authentic pieces in them. And I have lots of them. And this would have been from a poorer family. It's a gauzy piece of fabric, but on that gauzy piece of fabric, they have, this is an oil painting of little rosebuds. It's absolutely precious. Here's silk. This is embroidered. This is silk embroidered on red silk. And again, it just never made its way into a crazy quilt, but this would have been one of the first steps. They had to start embellishing these pieces prior to putting them together. This one is absolutely gorgeous. This is on silk velvet, and it's your water lilies, and the paint is so thick that it actually is dimensional. And again, that's on silk velvet. Here's another one. These little flowers on, everything is on silk. These are all 1880s. Someone put a lot of time into doing the artwork, but again, it never made it to their quilt. This one is on silk velvet, and again, it's an oil painting. See the little butterfly too? And the work that they did is it's just amazing. I mean, these women were artists, and this was their way. You know, in 1880s, we were basically, especially affluent women, were basically homebound. But one of their mark of excellence was their skill with the needle, and they wanted to excel at this. And Victorian Crazy Quilt gave them an avenue where they really could excel. Whoops, I left.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm going to show you some individual blocks so that you can see how they're put together. This one is called foundation piecing. So it's a solid block. My husband's going to change something.
Stop sharing.
Okay, this is the backing. It's called foundation piecing. You can see the stitching going through the back. And here's the front where you can see the silks and the embroidery stitches that they used around them.
Hey, Betsy, could I have just a second? If
Yes, sir.
someone, well, for those who are watching at home, if you are in the gallery view, you're only going to see a small screenshot of Betsy, but if you switch in the upper right-hand corner where it says view, if you click on that and hit speaker, Betsy will fill your screen and you'll be able to see what she's holding up. Thank you, Betsy.
We're looking for a view or something to click.
Well, top right-hand corner.
It says, there's an I with a circle, is that it?
No.
And then there's okay, and then there's
Just
leave meeting, and I don't think I want to leave the meeting.
Keep going. I'll see if I can find it.
Okay, while my husband's working on it.
Yeah, it's really more for the people at home.
Yeah.
It is,
Thank you. Go ahead.
but we have to figure out
Yeah,
how
go
to
ahead.
do it.
Go ahead.
Okay, here's another one where you can see the stitches are a little more crude, but the fabrics are very expensive. So like every other art, people had different levels of their ability. Here's another one that you can see, the foundation piecing, and this would have been not in blocks, this would have been a strip. So this is your strip foundation. This block, these are done prior to heavy embellishment and just a simple outline stitching. Here's the Japanese, oh, now I have Doug, I have you. How do we click on me? I have you full screen, Doug. Okay, this is a Victorian fan. And you can see that they pieced this fan first. Then they would applique it onto their crazy quilt versus piecing the pieces together. Okay. I'm looking for more pieces. Okay. I didn't do the twist. I didn't do these yet, did I? These are some of the threads they would have used. This is a cotton twist that would have been used on cotton crazy quilts and wool crazy quilts versus the silk. Remember, on silk crazy quilts, you always have to use everything in silk. When you get to cotton and wool, you can use any combination that you want. It doesn't matter. But silk, you really need to use silk on silk. I think maybe now it's time for questions.
Okay, let's see. I'm going to then say thank you, Betsy, for sharing your expertise with us so far today, because we're surely going to appreciate antique quilts, especially crazy quilts, so much more. So our Q&A will begin momentarily. Now is the time. If you have a question, please type your question into the chat box and Brenda will relay them to Betsy to be answered. As I indicated earlier, for those who joined late, once we go through the questions from the chat box, if there's anyone who's encountered difficulty using the chat box, we'll just monitor the screens for raised hands and invite you to unmute yourself and ask Betsy a question directly. So in the meantime, let me just tell you, we have 2 more virtual lectures planned in February and March. Our website has details about our February 22 lecture titled Writing Western New York's Eclipse Story Together. Speaker Deborah Ross, chair of the Rochester Eclipse Task Force and co-chair of the American Astronomical Society's Solar Eclipse Task Force, is our speaker. It's a wonderful introduction before April 8th's total solar eclipse. Our museum lies in the direct path of the spectacle, and we have a weekend of activities planned with storytellers, an auto show, tours of our heated buildings, blacksmithing demonstrations at the forge, and much more. And in March, our virtual lecture will feature Andrew Bullen, a Pullman, Illinois resident and historian who has written extensively on George M. Pullman, creator of the Pullman Palace Car Company. Hear about George's family, life, his business, how race relations and complex labor issues became part of the story. And Andrew will highlight some of the more unusual palace car types and describe the town of Pullman. So Brenda, how are we doing with those
I
questions?
have a few questions already.
Let's open up the questions now.
All right, Connie Trigger would like to know where people of lesser means would get their silk fabric from.
I'm sorry, where would people in Western Maine?
No, of lesser means, people who didn't have much money, how would they get their silk fabric?
Well, basically, people of lesser means would not have been buying silk fabric in the 1880s because there was no such a thing as less expensive fabric. It wouldn't start to, excuse me, it didn't start until the 1890s. And then they would buy it, wherever they bought fabric. But it was not around until the 1890s.
Okay, and Kathy Ashlyn wants to know if you've come across a quilt, a crazy quilt that wasn't stored correctly. So it needs to be cleaned. How would you do that?
Kathy, that is a major problem, and it happens a lot because unfortunately we're not born with an education. And people, it's, for example, a crazy quilt should never be in sun, it should never be behind glass, and it should never be packed away poorly, and they were put in attics and basements, and it's a major problem. What we have done, because you cannot wash them, is that hopefully the entire quilt is not gone, and what we do is we restore over that piece with the same fabric, because I have enough fabric that we can match the color and we match the pattern and the design and everything, and restore the pieces that need to be done. But unfortunately, if it's totally ruined, does you have a problem. But partially, believe me, we've done tons of those, dozens and dozens and dozens. So it can be saved, so you can hang it as long as it's not totally ruined. You cannot send it to the cleaners; they'll disintegrate it. No quilt should ever go to the cleaners. And as I said, you can't wash it because the fabrics are going to run, or some of them, the dark colors, are going to run. So you can
Okay.
contact me privately, and I'd be happy to help you.
All right, and then Linda and Harold Clark, how would you, if you come across a crazy quilt where the silk has the lead in it, how would you clean that?
You
Or
can't.
would you clean that?
But you can't clean a crazy quilt. It can never go. I've had people call me in tears because I send crazy quilts to the cleaners and they come back with threads of fabric, just threads. They'll just be disintegrated. You can't clean it. You need to keep it out of sun, direct sun. It should stay away from a lot of humidity and a lot of dryness. But if you have some 1890s silk that is not disintegrated and it's in perfect condition now, chances are it's going to stay that way as long as you take proper care of it. If you decide you want to store your crazy quilt, all you need to do is lay it down, cover it with a white sheet, just a cotton sheet, and fold it so there are no sharp folds, and then you can store it, never in plastic. If you store it, just put it in an old pillowcase or on a shelf, wrapped in that fabric. If you want to store it, if it's past use, but you want to save it, for posterity, for some other member of the family. But you can't wash them, just if you've lucked out and that 1890s fabric is still fine, just leave it alone.
Yep. All right. And then someone had a question. The quilts that have the oil painted fabric, are they painting on the fabric first before they add it to the quilt? Okay.
Absolutely. That's what I was trying to show before. Even here's this little one. They paint it first and then incorporate it into the quilt. They do not make the piece and then paint it. They paint it first and decide how they want to put it together. I have a
Okay.
feeling, now I've never made a crazy quilt. I'm actually not a quilter. But I have a feeling that they put all these fabrics, they got everything together and then decided how they wanted to put them, make the crazy, what they wanted the crazy quilt to look like. So they would have painted a lot of these if they were artists and wanted to do that, then make their crazy quilt.
Okay. And do most crazy quilts have foundation material?
Yes, most of them are. I've seen very few that aren't foundation piece. Most of them are foundation piece. It makes sense because you can start with one piece and then overlap to make the shape and the size that you want it to be, just one over the other. Instead of butting them like you do a normal quilt.
Right. That makes
So
sense.
the foundation allows you to do that.
Okay. And what's your suggestion on how to hang them for display?
We put what I call sleeves. They're pockets of fabric. Put one on the top and one on the bottom. They're about 5 inches wide. They're a complete tube of fabric that goes from one end to the other, 5 inches wide. And through those, you put a flat piece of wood. And we put them top and the bottom. Museums have always used the top one. I invented the bottom one, excuse me, because I don't like the way quilts wave. So it serves two purposes. You screw the top and the bottom to the wall. The bottom one keeps it from waving, but also supports the quilt. And with a crazy quilt, what's really cool with the two pockets is in a year or two, you can completely rotate it, which is healthy for the quilt. And it gives you a completely different piece of artwork. It's going to look totally different because the top and the bottom of a crazy quilt never look the same.
All right. And then someone else would like to know, how do you age them? How can you judge the age of a quilt?
You have to find the newest piece of fabric on it. So an 1880s quilt, if a quilt is 1880s, there can't be a piece of 1890s fabric on it. And printed fabrics are easier to date than solid fabrics, but with silks, you can feel the silks too. And I mean, obviously, if it's an 1890s quilt and somebody says it's made in 1880s, well, that's impossible. So you have to look for the newest piece of fabric.
Okay. And someone just made the comment that they find it similar to the African American quilts because they used whatever they had on hand.
Well, that wasn't just that's definitely African American, but it's also very American.
Yeah.
When I lived out west, but most of the quilts were made from scraps. They were not made from purchased fabrics. And once after the Revolutionary War, when women's clothing were made from cut pieces of fabric, we developed scraps. Now that's a whole nother lecture. That's the development of the quilt. But the early fabrics were only 12 inches selvage to selvage, so they used the whole piece. But later on, when they started cutting them up, they used the scraps. And poor families, African American, Western families, I know people in Oklahoma and Texas, were living in dirt floor homes, as poor as can be, but somehow they made these gorgeous quilts. And I've had some of them, and they're absolutely exquisite. But yes, it would be the same. It would be very similar.
And then someone wondered, and it's kind of an interesting, if somebody who had a lower income and they were, say, a dressmaker or they were employed by somebody, they just wondered if they could have had access to
Absolutely.
keep the scraps to
Absolutely.
fine fabrics. Yeah.
Absolutely. I have one quilt in the shop right now that it's here because the museum is interested in it, that comes directly from the family, and let me see. Okay, the grandfather was a janitor at the textile mill, and he would bring home the scraps of fabric for his wife to make the quilts. So there were many ways, and absolutely that happened all the time. Anyone that worked in the fabric mills, they could get scraps and bring them home. Dressmakers, tailors, even African American, people, even if you want to go back to the horrible slave era, the house slaves that made these exquisite quilts for their mistresses, they could end up with some of the fabrics. So absolutely.
That makes sense. And how many different embroidery patterns would be found in one, or is that like just an open, it all depends, right? I mean,
The mark of excellence to me, to an exquisite Victorian crazy quilt, is 100 different stitches. I've had some with hundreds on them. I mean, and copying them, a poor Jean, sometimes it's like insane because they have to be copied exactly. Same color thread, same stitching. When we restore something, it has to be an exact copy. And some of them have as many as 4 and 5 different stitches around one little piece. So it just depended upon the creator. And some of them, their mark of excellence was over the top, but they could show it, they could display it, and they could be proud of it without boasting, because back then you didn't brag or boast, but this is one way you could show off your ability. That's why quilts weren't signed, which bothers me today. Today we know to sign everything, but back then they felt signing something was pretentious. I wish they didn't think that way.
I don't sign mine. I need to get in that
sign them and
habit.
sign them and date them.
Yes, I know. I need to learn to do that.
Hmm.
Are there any other questions from anybody?
Well, let me talk a little bit about the care of Victorian crazy quilts.
Okay.
Victorian crazy quilts, like any quilt, should never be hung in the sun. It's good to rotate them. Some of them there's an obvious top, but most of them there isn't. If you want to store them, as I said, put them you don't need to buy fancy acid-free paper. A cotton sheet is obviously acid-free. Just wrap it in that. And if you need any help, you can contact me directly. I'm happy to help you with that. I also sell the silks and the fabrics. So I do have some of those too for people. A regular cotton quilt, just quickly, it's the same scenario. No direct sun, no washing machines, no dryers, and no cleaners. Please, a cleaner will make a rag. They'll throw them in the washing machine. So please don't do that. The only way to wash a quilt is literally by hand in the bathtub. That's the best way. And all my quilts that I sell have been organically washed in the bathtub, which is safe. But you've got to test your colors. 1880s, some of the colors were fugitive, which means they ran. And that's one of the problems you have with the silks. The burgundies, which was one of the favorite colors, burgundies and dark blues and any dark color, you're going to run into a problem. It's going to run. So be careful. And that's why you don't want a lot of humidity around them either, because of the humidity can get in there and literally will cause them to, they'll start running, and you just, obviously don't want that. And other than that, I just thank everybody for joining me with my first lecture on Zoom.
Brenda, you're muted at this moment. You had a comment to make?
Actually, I have a question.
Okay, Brenda, you're allowed.
All right, thank you. I'm a quilter, and like modern quilts, you can roll them around a pool noodle.
A what?
So
Pool noodle.
you know what, the swimming pool
Oh,
noodles?
yes. Yeah.
I think that's what they're called. A good storage method is to roll them up. And would you ever do that with a antique quilt?
Not with a silk one.
No? Okay, I
Because
wondered.
because if I think I know what you mean. Because my grandkids have had them. They're the round, the rubber things. They're
Yes,
about
yes.
3 inches in diameter.
Yeah, you
All
can
right. So
get,
if you
yeah,
figure 3 inches in diameter, wrapping it around that, it's going to be too tight. Whereas if you lay it down on the floor and put a sheet on it and fold it so it's like in 2 or 3 foot pieces when it's folded, it's going to be much safer and there won't be any sharp lines.
okay,
Museums roll cotton quilts, but they roll them on a fatter tube. I think it's like
Right.
4 inches.
right.
And cotton quilts, if you had a cotton quilt, you could do that. Silk quilts, I do not advise it.
Okay, because with modern fabrics, it's not an issue, but
I
That
know
makes sense.
I know zero about modern quilts. I stopped at 1955. That's it.
Wow. This was
So
wonderful. You did a great job.
Yes,
Thank you all.
thank you, Betsy. Thank you very much. Thank you for
Thank
coming.
you.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. I know a lot of people are itching to say hello because a lot of your friends have joined us. Many people who called me said they were your friends. So we're gonna
I
let
even see
people,
my granddaughter, my daughter, Jackie, who works for me, and Jean's around here someplace, but I don't know where she is.
folks want to unmute their and ask a question directly or say hello to Betsy. You can do that now.
Thank you. I say hello to everyone and love to my family. I miss you. They're in Florida and I'm up here.
Thank you
Betsy,
so
a great
much.
presentation.
My pleasure. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Betsy. I have a picture of the quilt you restored for me, hanging behind me.
That's why that looks familiar. Hi, Cheryl. How are you?
Hi.
Huh.
I wonder if everyone can see that.
Hang on, I might be able to put it. I have a
Oh, that's
picture
so
of it.
cool.
We
I
can
hope
see it.
Jean is on here someplace. I
Beautiful.
hope she can see that.
Hmm.
Because she would have been the one that restored that.
Hmm.
Did you say that's a picture of your quilt or that's the actual?
Yes,
That's the
it's a
actual
picture.
quilt.
I just put it in the Zoom chat. If the people want to click on it, they might be able to. I put a picture of it.
That's super.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
I've been on Zoom a few times.
This
So
is my first, and I have a feeling
Yeah.
it's not my last, but if my husband wasn't sitting next to me, it wouldn't even be my first. And my granddaughter Isabel, who's on there, practiced with me this morning. And there's my daughter Suzanne next to her. So it's great to see you all. And I see Jackie there too. Hi, Jackie. Jackie's my other restorer who's wonderful. So if there's any other questions, you can contact me and I'm happy to answer you.
This has been absolutely wonderful. I hope that you got over your jitters. Oh, I see someone else who wants to speak. Go ahead. Go ahead, Darlene. You're muted though, if you wanted to speak.
She has to unmute.
I just wanted to say that it was very nice. Thank you very much.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Hi, Betsy.
Hi, Judy.
There is another question that just came in. Someone wants to know if you sell online.
Yes, I do. I have a webpage, RockyMountainQuilts.com. My husband is my webmaster, and there's probably 600 quilts on there, all sizes, crazy quilts, regular quilts, everything's on there. I
Thank
do
you.
have a few in the shop that are not on my webpage that are originals that I just don't want the patterns copied. But other than that, yes, and I send everything on approval. I don't expect anyone to buy from a picture because colors on a computer do not necessarily correlate with the actual color of the quilt because everyone's computer is set differently. So I send on approval, and actually until the end of the month, I'm even having a sale. The first sale I've ever had in 37 years. So if you're looking for anything, it's a good time.
And someone also wants to know if you sell the supplies to make
I
one.
sell antique fabric and I have blocks, tops, fabrics, depression era feed sacks, and other things, and they'd have to call me to ask me.
All
But I
right,
do, yes.
Thank you.
And I have an open shop.
Betsy, would you like to give your phone number for folks?
My phone number is 207-363-6800. I ship out of state and in state, it's free shipping. And if you live out of state from Maine, which I think most of you do, there is no tax because it's being shipped out of state. And everything I sell is fully guaranteed to authenticity and condition. If anything has been restored, I have a silkscreen label that is on the back attesting to that fact because I only use original fabric and you would never know it's restored. There's no way of finding out, except that we do leave the original piece of fabric underneath 99% of the time, which is historically correct in my eyes.
I've just added Betsy's shop phone number to the chat box if you need to find that phone
Thank you.
number.
And my email is Betsy, BETSEY at rmquilts.com. My webpage is RockyMountainQuilts.com. And anybody is welcome Look.
Before we lose the rest of our audience, just want to remind folks that we will be making this program available. The recording of the program will be available on our website in the days to come, beginning on Monday. If you've already paid admission and seen the program and would like to view it again, I can give you a link to see the whole program at your leisure. Maybe you can watch it on a larger screen at home and see some of the quilts a little larger. But we will make that available to anyone that will be wanting to take advantage of that. So.
Perfect. I'm just gonna say hello to two of my granddaughters, Isabel and Sophia. Layla's in a water polo match today, so she's not there. And my daughter Suzanne, I see. Hi, Sue.
Hi, Mima.
Hi, guys. What a fun way to see everyone. Thank you for letting me do this. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. And you're absolutely right. This won't be your last.
We'll see. As long as my husband doesn't move more than 6 inches from me.
There you go. Well, we so appreciate it. This has been so informative. The quilts are exquisite that you showed us today, Betsy, and I'm sure you're going to get a few phone calls and emails at your shop from
There's a whole
today's
section,
programs.
if they look on the front page of my webpage, there's a scroll bar and it actually does, it's all the different sections of the quilts, and there's one there that's just of crazy quilts. So that, you know, they can scroll on there and look at more of them. And the ones that I showed you today are going to be on there because they're in the shop here for sale. I don't show clients' quilts and I never repeat clients' names, so you only get, you know, what I'm selling here.
Certainly.
But thank you again, everyone.
Thank you very
you.
much.
And thank you everyone for joining us. You can disconnect and have a wonderful afternoon.